Part 4, Chapter 21 of The Wild Olive by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 21. It was the middle of October when Evie wrote from Lennox to say she would come to town to meet Ford on his arrival, begging Miriam to give her shelter for a night or two. The Grants remaining abroad, Miss Jarrett had taken the house in 72nd Street for another winter. But as Evie would run up to New York alone, she preferred for the minute to be Miriam's guest. "The fact is, I'm worried to death," she wrote confidentially, "and you must help me to see daylight through this tangled mess of everybody saying different things. Aunt Queenie has gone completely back on Herbert, just because Uncle Jarrett has. That doesn't strike me as very loyal, I must say. I shouldn't think it right to desert anybody unless I wanted to. I wouldn't do it because someone else told me to. Not if he was my brother 10 times over. I mean to be just as true to Herbert as I can. Not that he makes it very easy for me, because he's broken altogether with Uncle Jarrett, and that seems to me the maddest thing. I certainly shan't get my trousseau from Aunt Helen now. I don't see what we're all coming to. Everybody's so queer, and they keep hinting things they won't say out, as if there was some mystery. I do wish I could talk to Billy about it. Of course I can't, the way matters stand. And speaking of Billy, that rich Mr. Bird, you remember I told you about him last winter, has asked me to marry him. Just think! I forget how much he has a year, but it's something awful. Of course I told him I couldn't give him a definite answer yet, but that if he insisted on it, I should have to make it no. He said he didn't insist, that he'd rather wait till I had time to make up my mind if I didn't keep him dangling. I told him I wouldn't keep him doing anything whatever, and that if he dangled at all, it would be entirely of his own accord. I think he liked my spirit, so he said he'd wait. We left it there, which was the wisest way, though I must say I didn't like his presuming on his money to think I would make a difference between him and the others. Money doesn't mean anything to me, though dear mamma hoped she would live to see me well established. She didn't, poor darling, but that's no reason why I shouldn't try to carry out her wishes. All the same, I mean to be true to Herbert just as long as possible, and so you may expect me on the 29th. If there was much in this letter that Miriam found disturbing, it was not the thought that Evie might be false to Ford, or that Ford might suffer, which alarmed her most. There was something in her that cried out in fear before the possibility that Norrie Ford might be free again. Her strength having sprung so largely from the hope of restoring the plans she had marred, the destruction of the motive left her weak. But worse than that was the knowledge that, though she had tried to empty her heart completely of its cravings, only its surface had been drained. It was to get assurance rather than to give information that she read fragments of Evie's letter to Conquest on the evening of his return from Omaha. He had come to give her the news of his success. That it was good news was evident in his face when he entered the room, and, almost afraid to hear it, she broached the subject of her anxiety about Evie first. "She's going to give him the sack. That's what she's going to give him," Conquest said conclusively, while Miriam folded the dashingly scribbled sheets. "You needn't be worried about her in the least. Miss Evie knows her way about as cleverly as a homing bee. She'll do well for herself, whatever else she may not do. Come now!" "I'm not thinking of that so much as that she should do her duty." "Duty? Pooh! That sort of little creature has no duty. The word doesn't apply to it. Evie is the most skilful mixture of irresponsible impulse and shrewd calculation you'll find in New York. She'll use both her gifts with perfect heartlessness, and yet in such a way that even her guardian angel won't know just where to find fault with her." "But she must marry Mr. Ford now." He was too busy with his own side of the subject to notice that her assertion had the intensity of a cry. He had a man's lack of interest in another man's love affairs, while he was blissfully absorbed in his own. "You might as well tell a swallow that it must migrate now," he laughed. "Poor Ford will feel it, I've no doubt, but we shall make it up to him for a good deal of it. We're going to pull him through." For the instant her anxiety was diverted into another channel. "Does that mean that Amelia Graham has told you anything?" "Oh, she's told us everything. I thought she would. I don't feel at liberty to give you the details before they come out at the proper time and place, but there's no harm in saying that my analysis of the old woman's psychological state was not so very far wrong. There's no question about it any longer. We'll pull him through, and by George, he's worth it." The concluding exclamation, uttered with so much sincerity, took her by surprise, transmuting the pressure about her heart into a mist of sudden tears. Tears came to her rarely, hardly, and seldom with relief. She was especially unwilling that Conquest should notice them now, but the attempt to dash them away only caused them to fall faster. She could see him watching her in a kind of sympathetic curiosity, slightly surprised in his turn at the unexpected emotion, and trying to divine its cause. Unable to bear his gaze any longer, she got up brusquely from her chair, retreating into the bay window, where, the curtains being undrawn, she stood looking down on the sea of lights, as beings above the firmament might look down on stars. He waited a minute, and came near to her only when he judged that he might do so discreetly. "You're unnerved," he said with tender kindliness. "That's why you're upset. You've had too much on your mind. You're too willing to take all the care on your own shoulders and not let other people hustle for themselves." She was pressing her handkerchief against her lips, so she made no reply. The moment seemed to him one at which he might go forward a little more boldly. All the circumstances warranted an advance from his position of reserve. "You need me," he ventured to say, with that quiet assurance which in a lover means much. "I understand you as no one else does in the world." Her brimming eyes gave him a look which was only pathetic, but which he took to be one of assent. "I've always told you I could help you," he went on with tranquil earnestness, "and I could. You've too many burdens to carry alone, burdens that don't belong to you, but which I know you'll never lay down. Well, I'll share them. There's Wayne now. He's too much for you by yourself. I don't mean from the material point of view, but the whole thing, it wears on you. It's bound to. Wayne is my friend just as much as yours. He's my responsibility, so long as you take it in that light. I've been thinking of him a lot lately, and I see how, in my house, could put him up ideally." Still pressing her handkerchief against her lips with her right hand, she put out her left in a gesture of deprecation. He understood it at once of encouragement, and went on. "You must come and look at my house. You've never really seen it, and I think you'd like it. I think you'd like everything. I've got everything to make you happy, and if you'd only let me do it, you'll make me happy too." She felt able to speak at last. Her eyes were still brimming as she turned towards him, but brimming only as pools are when the rain is over. "I want you to be happy. You're so good and kind, and you've done so much for me. You deserve it." She turned away from him again. With her arm on the woodwork of the window, she rested her forehead rather wearily on her hand. He understood so little of what was passing within her, she found it a relief to suspend for the minute her comedy of spontaneous happiness, letting her heart ache unrestrainedly. Her left hand hanging limp and free, she made no effort to withdraw it when she felt him clasp it in his own. Since she had subscribed to the treaty months ago, since she had insisted on doing it rightly or wrongly, it made little difference when and how she carried the conditions out. So they stood, hand in hand together, tacitly, but, as each knew, quite effectually, plighted. In her silence, her resignation, her evident consent to read the proof of that love which to his mind no longer needed words. Late that night, after he had gone away, she wrote to Evie, beseeching her to be true to Ford. The letter was so passionate, so little like herself, that she was afraid of destroying it if she waited till morning, so she posted it without delay. The answer came within 48 hours, in the shape of a telegram from Evie. She was coming to town at once, though it wanted still 3 or 4 days to Ford's arrival. It was a white little Evie with drawn face who threw herself into Miriam's arms at the station, clutching at her with a convulsive sob. "Miriam, I can't do it," she whispered in a kind of terror. "They say he's going to be put in jail." Her voice rose on the last word, so that 1 or 2 people paused in their rush past to glance at the pitifully tragic little face. "Hush, darling," Miriam whispered back. "You'll tell me about it as we go home." But in the motor Evie could only cry, clinging to Miriam as she used to do in troubled moments in childhood. Arriving at the apartment, Wayne had to be faced with some measure of self-control, and then came dinner. At table, Evie, outwardly mistress of herself by this time, talked feverish nonsense about their common friends in Lennox, after which she made an excuse for retiring early. It was only in the bedroom, when they were secure from interruption, that Miriam heard what Evie had to tell. She was tearless now, and rather indignant. "I've had the strangest letter from Herbert," she declared excitedly, as soon as Miriam entered the room. "I couldn't have believed he wrote it in his senses if Aunt Queenie hadn't heard the same thing from Uncle Jarrett. He says he's got to go to jail." There was the same rising inflection on the last word, suggestive of a shriek of horror, that Miriam had noticed in the station. In her white peignoir, her golden hair streaming over her shoulders, and her hands flung wide apart with an appealing dramatic gesture, Evie was not unlike some vision of a youthful Christian martyr, in spite of the hairbrush in her hand. Miriam sat down sidewise on the edge of the couch, looking up at the child in pity. She felt that it was useless to let her remain in darkness any longer. "Of course he has to," she said, trying to make her tone as matter-of-fact as might be. "Didn't you know it?" "Know it? Did you?" Evie stepped forward, bending over Miriam as if she meant to strike her. "I knew it in a general way, darling. I suppose when he gives himself to the police—" "The police!" Evie screamed. "Am I to be engaged to a man who gives himself up to the police?" "It will only be for a little while, dear." "I don't care whether it's for a little while or forever. It can't be. What is he thinking of? What are you thinking of? Don't you see? How can I face the world with all my invitations when the man I'm engaged to is in jail?" Evie's hands flew up in a still more eloquent gesture, while the blue eyes, usually so soft and veiled, were wide with flaming interrogation. "I knew that in some ways it might be hard for you." Evie laughed, a little silvery, mirthless ripple of scorn. "I must say, Miriam, you choose your words skilfully. But you're wrong, do you see? There's no way in which it can be hard for me, because there's no way in which it's possible." "Oh, yes, there is, dear, if you love him." "That has nothing to do with it. Of course I love him. Haven't I said so? But that doesn't make any difference. Can't I love him without being engaged to a man who has to go to jail?" "Certainly. But you can't love him if you don't feel that you simply must stand by his side." "There you go again, Miriam, with your queer ideas. It's exactly what anyone would expect you to say." "I hope so." "Oh, you needn't hope so, because they would, anyone who knew you. But I have to do what's right. I know what I feel in my conscience, and I have to follow it. And besides, I couldn't. Her voice began to rise again. "I couldn't face it. I couldn't bear it. Not if I loved him a great deal better than I do." "That's something you must think about very seriously, dear." "I don't have to," she cried with a stamp of her foot. "I know it already. It wouldn't make any difference if I thought about it 1,000 years. I couldn't be engaged to a man who was in jail, not if I worshipped the ground he trod on." "But when he's innocent, darling—" "It's jail just the same. I can't be engaged to people just because they're innocent. It isn't right to expect it of me. And anyhow," she added passionately, "I can't do it. It would kill me. I should never lift my head again. I can't. It's hateful of anyone to say I ought to. I'm surprised at you, Miriam, when you know how dear Mamma would have forbidden it. It's all very well for you to give advice when you have no family and no one to think about, and hardly any invitations. But I can't, and there's an end of it. If that's your idea of love, then I must say my conception is a little different. I've always had high ideals, and I feel obliged to hold to them, however you may condemn me." She ended with a catch in her breath, something like a sob. "But I'm not condemning you, Evie, dear. If you feel what you say, there's nothing for it but to see Mr. Ford and tell him so." At this suggestion, Evie sobered. She was a long time silent before she observed, in a voice that had become suddenly calm and significantly casual, "That's easy for you to say." "If you speak to him as decidedly as to me, I should think it would be easy for you to do." "And still easier for you?" Evie spoke in that tone of unintentional intention which is most pointed. It was not lost on Miriam, who recoiled from the mere thought. It seemed to her better to ignore the hint, but Evie, with feverish eagerness, refused to let it pass. "Did you hear what I said?" she persisted sharply. "I heard it, dear, but it didn't seem to me to mean anything." "That would depend on whether you heard it only with the ear or in the heart." "You know that everything that has to do with you is in my heart." "Well, then." "But if you mean by that I should tell Mr. Ford you're not going to marry him, why, it's out of the question." "Then who's to tell him? I can't. It's not to be expected." "But, darling, you must. This is awful." Miriam got up and went toward her, but Evie, who was nervously brushing her hair, edged away. "Of course it's awful, but I don't see the use of making it worse than it need be. He'll feel it a great deal more if he sees me, and so shall I." "And what shall I feel?" Miriam spoke unguardedly, but Evie was too preoccupied to notice the bitterness of the tone. "I don't see why you should feel anything at all. It's nothing to you, or very little. It wouldn't be your fault, nor any more than it's the postman's if he has to bring you a letter with bad news." Miriam went back to her place on the edge of the couch, where, with her forehead bowed for a minute on her hand, she sat reflecting. An overwhelming desire for confidence, for sympathy perhaps, for the clearing up of mysteries in any case, was impelling her to tell Evie all that had ever happened between Ford and herself. It had been necessary to maintain so many reserves that possibly this new light would enable Evie to see her own duty more straightforwardly. "Darling," she began, "I wanted to tell you something." Before she could proceed, Evie flung the hairbrush on the floor and uttered a great swelling sob. With her hands hanging at her sides and her golden head thrown back, she wept with the abandonment of a child, while suggesting the seraphic suffering of a grieving angel by some old master. In an instant Miriam had her in her arms. It was the appeal she had never been able to resist. "There, there, my pet," she said soothingly, drawing her to the couch. "Come to Miriam, who loves you. There, there." Evie clung to her piteously, with flower-like face tilted outward and upward for the greater convenience of weeping. "Oh, I'm so lonely," she sobbed. I'm so lonely. I wish dear mamma hadn't died." Miriam pressed her the more closely. "I'm so lonely, and everything's so strange, and I don't know what to do, and he's going to be put in jail, and you're so unkind to me. Oh, dear, I can't tell him. I can't tell him. I can't." She pillowed her head on Miriam's shoulder, like a child that would force a caress from the hand that had just been striking it. The action filled Miriam with that kind of self-reproach which the weak creature inspires so easily in the strong. In spite of her knowledge to the contrary, she had the feeling of having acted selfishly. "No, darling," she said at last, as Evie's sobs subdued into convulsive tremblings. "You needn't tell him. I'll tell him. He'll understand how hard it's been for you. It's been hard for everyone, and especially for you, darling. I'll do my best. You know I will. And I'm sure he'll understand. There, there," she comforted, as Evie's tears broke out afresh. "Have your cry out, dear. It will do you good. There, there." So Evie went back next day to Lennox, while Miriam waited for Ford. End of Part 4, Chapter 21. Part 4, Chapter 22 of The Wild Olive by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 22. A few days later she read his name, in a morning paper, in the Asiatic's list of passengers, the steamer having arrived at Quarantine the night before. Mr. John Norrie Ford. Though flung carelessly into a paragraph printed in small type, it seemed to blaze in fire on the page. It was as if all America must rise at it. As she looked from the window, it was with something like surprise that she saw the stream of traffic roaring onward, heedless of the fact that this dread name was being hawked in the streets and sold at the newsstands. She sent out for the evening papers that appear at midday, being relieved and astonished to find that, as yet, it had created no sensation. She was not deceived by his ease of manner when he appeared at the apartment in the afternoon. Though he carried his head loftily and smiled with his habitual air of confidence, she could see that the deep waters of the proud had gone over his soul. Their ebb had streaked his hair and beard with white, and deepened the wrinkles that meant concentrated will into the furrows that come of suffering. She was more or less prepared for that. It was the outward manifestation of what she had read between the lines of the letters he had written her. As he crossed the room with hand outstretched, her one conscious thought was of the chance to be a woman and a helpmeet Evie had flung away. She had noticed how, on the very threshold, he had glanced twice about the room, expecting to find her there. They did not speak of her at once. They talked of commonplace, introductory things: the voyage, the arrival, the hotel at which he was staying, anything that would help her, and perhaps him, to control the preliminary nervousness. There was no sign of it, however, on his part, while she felt her own spirit rising, as it always did, to meet emergencies. Presently she mentioned her fears regarding his use of his true name. "No, it isn't dangerous," he assured her, "because I'm out of danger now. Thank the Lord, that's all over. I don't have to live with a great hulking terror behind me any longer. I'm a man like any other. You can't imagine what it means to be yourself and not to care who knows it. I'm afraid I parade my name just like a boy with a new watch who wants to tell everyone the time. So far no one has paid any particular attention, but I dare say that will come. Is Evie here?" "She's not here today." "Why not?" he asked sharply. "She said she would be. She said she'd come to town." "She did come to town, but she thought she'd better not stay." "Not stay? Why shouldn't she stay? Is anything up? You don't mean that Miss Jarrett—" "No, Miss Jarrett has nothing to do with it. I know her brother has written to her in the way you must be prepared for, but she couldn't have kept Evie from waiting for you if Evie herself had wanted to," he finished, as she seemed to hesitate at the words. Since she said nothing to modify this assertion, she hoped he would comprehend its gravity. Indeed, he seemed to be trying to attenuate that when he spoke next. "I suppose she has engagements or something." "She did have engagements, but she could have put them off." "Only she didn't care to. I see." She allowed him time to accept this fact before going on. "Her return to Lennox," she said then, "wasn't because of her engagements." "Then it must have been because of me. Didn't she want to see me?" "She didn't want to tell you what she felt she would have to say." "Oh, so that was it." He continued to sit looking at her with an expression of interrogation, though it was evident from his eyes that his questions had been answered. They sat in the same relative positions as on the night of their last long talk together, he in his big armchair, she in her low one. It struck her as strange, while he stared at her with that gaze of inquiry from which the inquiry was gone, that she, who meant so little to his inner life, should be called on again to live through with him minutes that must forever remain memorable in his existence. "Poor little thing, so she funked telling me." The comment was made musingly to himself, but she took it as if addressed to her. "She wasn't equal to it." "But you are. You're equal to anything, aren't you?" He smiled with that peculiar twisted smile which she had noticed at other times when he was concealing pain. "One is generally equal to what one has to do. All the same," she added, with an impulse she could not repress, "I'm sorry to be always associated in your mind with things that must be hard for you." "You're associated in my mind with everything that's high and noble. That's the only memory I shall ever have of you. You've been with me through some of the dark spots of my life. But if it hadn't been for you, I shouldn't have found the way." "Thank you. I'm glad you can say that. I should be even more sorry than I am to give you this news today, if it were not that perhaps I can explain things a little better than Evie could." I don't imagine that they require much explanation. I've seen from Evie's letters that she was afraid of the situation. She hasn't changed toward you. Do you mean by that she still cares anything about me? She says she does. But you don't believe her. I'm not entitled to an opinion. It's something you and she must work out together. All I can do is to tell you what may give you a little hope. She watched for the brightening effect of these words upon him, but he sat looking absently at the floor, as if he had not heard them. Evie is afraid, she continued, but I think it's only fair to remember that the circumstances might well frighten any young girl of her sort. He showed that he followed her by nodding assent, though he neither lifted his head nor spoke. She wanted me to tell you that while the trial and other things are going on, she couldn't be engaged to you. I'm using her own expression, but she didn't say that, when it was all over and you were free, she wouldn't marry you. I noticed that. He looked up quickly. I'm not sure that I catch your drift. I mean that when it's all over, and everything has ended as you hope it will, it may be quite possible for you to win her back. He stared at her with an incredulous lifting of the eyebrows. Would you advise me to try? It isn't a matter I could give you advice about. I'm showing you what might be possible, but no, that sort of thing doesn't work. There's just a chance that Evie might have stuck to me spontaneously. But since she didn't... Since she didn't what? She was quite right not to. I admit that. It's in the order of things. She followed her instincts rather than her heart. I'm ready to believe that. But there are times in life when instinct is a pretty good guide. Am I to understand that you're not hurt or disappointed? Because in that case... I don't know whether I am or not. That's frank. I'm feeling so many things all at once that I can hardly distinguish one emotion from another or tell which is strongest. I only know, it's become quite plain to me, that a little creature like Evie couldn't find a happy home in my life, any more than a hummingbird, as you once called her, could make its nest among crags. Do you mean by that, she asked slowly, that you're definitely letting her go? I mean that Evie being what she is, and I being what life has made me, isn't it perfectly evident? Can you fancy us tied together, now? I never could fancy it. I haven't concealed that from you at any time. But since you loved her, and she loved you... That was true enough in its way. In its way, it's still true. Evie still loves the man I was, perhaps, and the man I was loves her. The difference is that the man I was isn't sitting here in front of you. One changes with years, of course. I didn't suppose one could change in a few months like that. One changes with experience. Above all, with that kind of experience which people generally call suffering. That's the great alchemist. Generally often transmutes our silver into gold. In my case, Evie was silver. But I found there's something else that stands for. So that, she interposed quickly, you're not sorry that Evie... He got up restlessly and stood with his back to the empty fireplace. It isn't a case for sorrow, he replied after a minute's thinking, as it isn't one for joy. It's one purely for acceptance. When I first knew Evie, I was still something of a kid. It was so all the more because the kid element in me had never had full play. I was arrogant and cocksure and certain of my ability to manipulate the world to suit myself. That was all Evie saw, and she liked it. And as far as she had it in her to fall in love with anything, she fell in love with it. He took a turn or two across the room, coming back to his stand on the hearthrug. I've travelled far since then, he continued. I've had to travel far. Evie hasn't been able to come with me, and that's all there is to the story. It isn't her fault, because when I asked her, I had no intention of taking this particular way. It was I who drove you into that, she said, with a hint of remorse. Yes, you, and conscience, and whatever else I honour most. I give you the credit first of all, because if it hadn't been for you, I shouldn't have had the moral energy to assert my true self against the false one. Isn't it curious that, after having made me Herbert Strange, it should be you who turned me into Norrie Ford again? It means that you exercise supreme power over me, a kind of creative power. You can make of me what you care, too. It's no wonder that I've come to see—" He paused in doubt as to how to express himself, while her eyes were fixed on him in troubled questioning. "It's no wonder," he went on again, "that I've come to see everything in a truer light, Evie as well as all the rest of it." With a renewed impulse to move about, he strode towards the bay window, where he stood for a few seconds, looking out and trying to coordinate his thoughts. Wheeling round again, he drew up a small chair close to hers, seating himself sidewise with his arm resting on the back. He looked like a man anxious to explain himself. "You're blaming me, I think, because I don't take Edie's affection more to heart. Isn't that so?" "I'm not blaming you. I may be a little surprised at it." "You wouldn't be surprised at it if you knew all I've been through. It's difficult to explain to you." "There's no reason why you should try." "But I want to try. I want you to know. You see," he pursued, speaking slowly, as if searching for the right words, "you see, it's largely a question of progress, of growth. Trouble has two stages. In the first, you think it hard luck that you should have to meet it. In the second, you see that, having met it and gone through it, you come out into a region of big experience where everything is larger and nobler than you thought it was before. Now, you'd probably think me blatant if I said that I feel myself emerging into that." "No, I shouldn't. As a matter of fact, I know you're doing it." "Well, then, having got there, out into that new kind of world," he sketched the vision with one of his Latin gestures, "I discover that, for one reason or another, poor little Evie has stayed on the far side of it. She couldn't pass the first gate with me, or the second, or the third, to say nothing of those I have still to go through. You know I'm not criticizing or finding fault with her, don't you?" She assured him of that. "And yet I must go on, you see. There's no waiting or turning back for me, any more than for a dying man. No matter who goes or who stays, I must press forward. Evie can't make the journey with me. I can only feel relieved that she's able to slip out of it. But I must still go on. I can't look back. I can't even be sorry, because I'm coming into the new, big land. You see what I mean?" She signified again that she followed him. "But the finding of a new land doesn't take anything from the old one. It only enlarges the world. Europe didn't become different because they discovered America. The only change was in their getting to know a country where the mountains were higher, and the rivers broader, and the sunshine brighter, and where there was a chance for the race to expand. Evie remains what she was. The only difference is that my eyes have been opened to a new ideal." It was impossible for her not to guess at what he meant. Independently of words, his earnest eyes told their tale, while he bent toward her like a man not quite able to restrain himself. In the ensuing seconds of silence, she had time to be aware of three distinct phases of emotion within her consciousness, following each other so rapidly as to seem simultaneously. A throb of reckless joy in the perception that he loved her was succeeded by the knowledge that loyalty to conquest must make rejoicing vain, while it flashed on her that, having duped herself once in regard to him, she must not risk the humiliating experience a second time. It was this last reflection that prevailed, keeping her still and unresponsive. After all, his new ideal might be something or someone quite different from what her fond imagining was so ready to believe. "I suppose," she said vaguely, for the sake of saying something, "that trial is the first essential to maturity. We need it for our ripening, as the flowers and fruit need wind and rain." "And there are things in life," he returned quickly, "that no immature creature can see. That's the point I want you to notice. It explains me. In a way, it's an excuse for me." "I don't need excuses for you," she hastened to say, "any more than I require to have anything explained." "No, of course not. You don't care anything about it. It It's only I who do. But I care so much that I want you to understand why it was that I didn't care before." She felt the prompting to stop him, to silence him, but once more she held herself back. There was still a possibility that she was mistaking him, and her pride was on its guard. "It was because I didn't know any better," he burst out in naive self-reproach. "It was because I couldn't recognize the fine thing when I saw it. I've had that experience in other ways, and with just the same result. It was like that when I first began to hear good music. I couldn't make it out. It was nothing but a crash of sounds. I prefer the ditties and dances of a musical comedy, and it was only by degrees that I began to find them flat. Then my ear caught something of the wonderful things in the symphonies that used to bore me. You see, I'm slow. I'm stupid." "Not at all," she smiled. "It's quite a common experience." "But I'm like that all through, with everything. I've been like that with women. I used to be attracted by quite an ordinary sort. It's taken me years, all these years, till I'm 33, to see that there's a perfect expression of the human type, just as there's a perfect expression of any kind of art. And I've found it." He bent farther forward, nearer to her. There was a light in his face that seemed to her to denote enthusiasm quite as much as love. To her wider experience and emotions, this discovery of himself which was involved in his discovery of her was rather youthful, provoking a faint smile. "You're to be congratulated, then," she said, with an air of distant friendliness. "It isn't everyone who's so fortunate." "That's true. There's only one man in the world who's more fortunate than I. That's Conquest." "Oh!" In the brusqueness with which she started, she pushed her chair slightly back from him. It was to conceal her agitation that she rose, steadying herself on the back of the chair in which she had been seated. "Conquest saw what I didn't, that it was too late." He was on his feet now, facing her, with the chair between them. "I wish you wouldn't say any more," she begged, though without ever emphasis of pleading. She was anxious, for her own sake as well as for his, to keep to the tone of the colloquial. "I don't see why I shouldn't. I'm not going to say anything to shock you. I know you're going to marry Conquest. You told me so before I went away, and I should like to remind you that Mr. Conquest is the best friend you have. When you hear what he's done for you, you will see that you owe him more than you do any man in the world." "I know that. I'm the last to forget it. But it can't do any harm to tell the woman who's going to be his wife that I owe her even more than I do him." "It can't do any harm, perhaps, but when I asked you not to—" "I can't obey you. I shouldn't be a man if I went through life without some expression of my gratitude, and now's the only time to make it. There are things which I wasn't free to say before, because I was bound to Evie, and which it will soon be too late for you to listen to, because you'll be bound to him. You're not bound to him yet." "I am bound to him," she said, in a tone in which there were all the regrets he had no reason to divine. "I don't know what you think of saying, but whatever it is, I implore you not to say it." "It's precisely because you don't know that I feel the necessity of telling you. It's something I owe you. It's like a debt. It isn't as if we were just any man and any woman. We're a man and a woman in a very special relation to each other. No matter what happens, nothing can change that. And it isn't as if we were going to live in the same world, in the same way. You will be Conquest's wife, a great lady in New York. I shall be, well, heaven only knows what I shall be, but nothing that's likely to cross your path again. All the same, it won't hurt you. It wouldn't hurt any woman, however good, to hear what I'm going to tell you. It wouldn't hurt any man, not even Conquest, that it should be said to his wife in the way that I shall say it. If I could, I wouldn't—" "Wait a minute," she said suddenly. "Let me ask you something." She took a step towards him, though her hand rested still on the back of the chair. "If I know it already," she continued, looking him in the eyes, "there would be no necessity for you to speak?" He took the time to consider this in all its bearings. "I'd rather tell you in my own words," he said at last. "But if you assure me that you know, I shall be satisfied." She took a step nearer to him still. Only the tips of her fingers now rested on the back of the chair, to which she held as to a bulwark. Before she spoke she glanced round the room, as though afraid lest the doors and walls might mistake her words for a confession. "Then I do know," she said, quietly. End of Part 4, Chapter 22. Part 4, Chapter 23 of The Wild Olive by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 23. The old lady was willing enough to talk, Conquest assured Ford in his narrative of the taking of Amalia Graham's testimony. There's nothing more loquacious than remorse. I figured on that before going out to Omaha. But if she had no hand in the crime, I don't see where the remorse comes in. Oh, it comes in vicariously. She feels it for Jacob, since Jacob didn't live to feel it for himself. It involves a subtle element of wifely devotion, which I guess you're too young or too inexperienced to understand. She was glad old Jacob was gone, so that she could make his confession with impunity. She was willing to make any atonement within her power, since it was too late to call him to account. Isn't that a bit far-fetched? Well, possibly, except to a priest, or a lawyer, or a woman herself. It isn't often that a woman's heroism works in a straight line like a soldier's or a fireman's. It generally pops at you round some queer corner where it takes you by surprise. Before leaving Omaha, I come to see that Amalia Graham was by no means the least valiant of her sex. Conquest's smoking room, with its space and height, its deep leather armchairs, its shaded lamps, its cheerful fire, suggested a club rather than a private dwelling, and invited the most taciturn guests to confidence. Ford stretched himself before the blaze with an enjoyment rendered keener by the thought that it might be long before he had occasion to don a dinner jacket again, or taste such a good Havana. Though it was only the evening of his arrival, he was eager to give himself up. Now that he had squared himself, as he expressed it, with Miriam Strange, he felt he put the last touch to his preparations. Kilcup and Warren were holding him back for a day or two, but his own promptings were for haste. I admit, Conquest continued to explain as he fidgeted about the room, moving a chair here or an ashtray there, with the fussiness of an old bachelor of housekeeping tastes, I admit that I thought the old woman was trying it on first, but I came to the conclusion that she had told a true story from the start. When she gave her evidence at your trial, she thought you were the man. There's nothing surprising in that. They almost made me think so, too. It did look fishy, my friend. You won't mind my saying that much. Clearer heads than your jury of village storekeepers and Adirondack farmers might have given the same verdict. But old Lady Graham's responsibility hadn't begun then. It was a matter of 2 or 3 years before she came to see, as women do see things about the men they live with, that the hand which did the job was Jacob's. By that time you had disappeared into space, and she didn't feel bound to give the old chap away. She says she would have done it if it could have saved you, but since you had saved yourself, she confined her attentions to shielding Jacob. You may credit as much or as little of that as you please, but I believe the bulk of it. In any case, since it does the trick for us, we have no reason to complain. Come now. I'm not going to complain of anything. It's been a rum experience all through, but I can't say that in certain aspects I haven't enjoyed it. I have enjoyed it. If it weren't for the necessity of deceiving people who are decent to you, I'd go through it all again. That's game, Conquest said approvingly as he worked round to the hearthrug, where he stood cutting the end of a cigar, with Ford's long figure stretched out obliquely before him. I would, Ford assured him. I'd go through it all again like a shot. It's been a lark from, I won't say from start to finish, but certainly from the minute, let me see just when, certainly from the minute when Miss Strange beckoned to me over old Wayne's shoulder. An odd look came by degrees into Conquest's face, the look of pitying amusement with which one listens to queer things said by someone in delirium. He kept the cutter fixed in the end of the cigar, too much astonished to complete his task. Since Miss Strange did what? Ford was too deeply absorbed in his own meditations to notice the tone. I mean, since she pulled me through. Conquest's face broke into a broad smile. "Are you dreamy, old chap, or have you got 'em again?" "I'm going back in the story," Ford explained with a hint of impatience. "I'm talking about the night when Miss Strange saved me." "Miss Strange saved you? How?" Ford raised himself slowly in his chair, his long legs stretched out straight before him, and his body bent stiffly forward, as he stared up at Conquest in puzzled interrogation. "Do you mean to say," he asked incredulously, "that she hasn't told you that?" "Perhaps you'll be good enough to tell me yourself. I'll be hanged if I know what you're talking about." There was suppressed irritation in the way in which he tore off the end of the cigar and struck a match. Ford let himself sink back into the chair again. "So she never told you? By George, that's like her. It's just what I might have expected." "Look here," Conquest said sharply. "Did you know Miss Strange before you came up here from South America?" He stood with his cigar unlighted, for he had let the match burn down to his fingers before attempting to apply it. "Was your taking the name of Strange," he demanded with sudden inspiration, "merely an accident, as I suppose it was, or had it anything to do with her?" It wasn't an accident, and it did have something to do with her. "Just so, and you kept it dark?" Something in Conquest's intonation caused Ford to look up. He saw a man with face suddenly growing grey, as though a light had gone out of it. He was disturbed only to the point of feeling that he had spoken tactlessly, and proceeded to repair the error. "I kept it dark for obvious reasons. If Miss Strange didn't tell you about it, it's because she isn't the kind of person to talk of an incident in which her own part was so noble. I'll give you the whole story now." "I should be obliged to you," Conquest said dryly. He sat down on the very edge of one of the big armchairs, leaning forward, and fingering his still unlighted cigar nervously as he watched Ford puff out successive rings of smoke before beginning. He was less on his guard to screen the intenseness with which he listened, because Ford spoke at first in a dreamy way, without looking in his direction. With more insight into the circumstances surrounding him, Ford would have told his tale with greater reticence. As it was, he spoke with enthusiasm, an enthusiasm born of an honest desire that Conquest should see the woman he was about to marry in the full beauty of her character. In regard to this, he himself had made the discovery so slowly and so recently that he was animated by something like a convert's zeal. Beginning his narrative quietly, in a reminiscent vein, with intervals in which he lapsed altogether into meditation, he was presently fired with all the animation in a storyteller when he perceives he is holding his hearer spellbound. As a matter of fact, he was moved not so much by the desire of convincing Conquest of Miriam Strange's nobility, as by the impulse to do her justice, once in his life at least, in language of his own. It was a naive bit of eloquence, of which no detail was lost on the experienced man of the world, who sat twirling his cigar with nervous fingers, his eyes growing keener in proportion as his face became more grey. It was part of his professional requirement to be able to draw his deductions from some snatch of human drama as he listened to its unfolding. His quickness and accuracy of judgment had indeed been a large element in his success, so that the habit of years enabled him to preserve a certain calmness of comprehension now. It lost nothing in being a studied calmness, since the forcing of his faculties within restraint concentrated their acumen. Ford concluded with what was for him an almost lyric outburst. "By George, Conquest, I didn't know there were such women in the world. She's been a revelation to me, as art and religion are revelations to other people. She came to me as the angel came to Peter in the prison, but like Peter, I didn't know it was an angel. There's a sort of glory about her, a glory where it takes a higher sense than any I've got to see and understand. After all she's done for me, after all this time, I'm only now beginning to get glimpses of it. But it's merely as we get glimpses of an infinite beyond because we see the stars. She's a mystery to me, in the same way that genius is a mystery, or holiness. I didn't appreciate her because I hadn't the soul. and yet it's in seeing that I hadn't the soul that I began to get it. That's curious, isn't it? She's like some heavenly spirit that's passed by me and touched me into newness of life." His ardour was so sincere, his hymn of praise so spontaneous, that he expected some sort of echo back. It seemed to him that even if Conquest did not join in this chant in honour of the woman who presumably loved him, whom more presumably still he loved, it would be but natural for him to applaud it. Ford knew that if anyone else had sung of Miriam Strange as he had just been singing, he would have leaped to his feet and wrung the man's hand till it ached. It surprised him, therefore, it disappointed him, that Conquest should sit unmoved, unless the spark-like twinkle of his little eyes could be taken as emotion. It was a relief to Conquest to get up, scratch another match, and light his cigar at last, turning his back so that it should not be seen that his fingers trembled. When he was sure of himself, he faced about again, taking his seat. "It's the most amazing story I ever heard," was his only comment, in response to Ford's look of expectation. "I hoped it might strike you as something more than amazing," Ford ventured, after a minute's waiting for a more appreciative word. "Perhaps it will when I get my breath. You must give me time for that. Do you actually tell me that she kept you in her studio for weeks?" 3 weeks and 4 days, to be exact. "And that she furnished you with food and clothing?" "And money, but I paid that back." "And got you away in that ingenious fashion?" "Just as I told you." "Amazing, simply amazing. And," he added with some bitterness, "you came back here, and you and she together took us all in." Ford drew his cigar from his lips, and, turning in his chair, faced Conquest in an attitude and with a look which could not be misinterpreted. "I came back here and took you all in, if you like. Miss Strange had nothing to do with it. She didn't even expect me." The last sentence gave Conquest the opening he was looking for, but now that he had it, he hesitated to make use of it. In his memory were the very words Miriam Strange had stammered out to him in the sort of confession no woman ever makes willingly. "Things happened, such as don't generally happen, and even if he never comes, I'd rather go on waiting for him, uselessly." It was all growing clear to him, and yet not so clear but that there was time even now to let the matter drop into the limbo of things it is best not to know too much about. It was against his better judgment, then, his better judgment as a barrister at law, that he found himself saying, "She didn't expect you at that day and date, perhaps, but she probably looked for you sometime." "Possibly, but if so, I know little or nothing about it." The reply, delivered with a certain dignified force of intention, recalled Conquest to a sense of his own interests. He had too often counselled his clients to let sleeping dogs lie, not to be aware of the advantage of doing it himself. And so, restraining his jealous curiosity, he turned the conversation back to the evidence of Amalia Graham. During the next half hour he manifested that talent, partly native and partly born of practice, which he had often commended in himself, of talking about one thing and thinking of another. His exposition of the line to be adopted in Ford's defence was perfectly lucid, and all the while he was saying to himself that this was the man whom Miriam Strange had waited for through 8 romantic years. The fact leaped at him, but it was part of his profession not to be afraid of facts. If they possessed adverse qualities, one recognized them boldly in the practice of law, chiefly with a view of circumventing them. The matter presented itself, first of all, not as one involving emotional or moral issues, but as an annoying arrangement of circumstances which might cheat him out of what he had honestly acquired. He had no intention of being cheated by anyone whatever, and, as he made a rapid summary of the points of the case, he saw that the balance of probabilities was in his favour. It was to make that clear to Ford that he led the conversation back again to the subject of his adventures, tempting him to repeat at least a portion of his hymn of praise. By the time he had finished it, Conquest was able to resume the friendly, confidential tone with which they had begun the evening. "It's very satisfactory to me, old man,"
he said, between quiet puffs of his cigar, "to know that you think so highly of Miss Strange, because, I don't know whether you have heard it, she and I are to be married before long." He looked to see Ford disconcerted by this announcement, and was surprised to see him take it coolly. "Yes, I knew that. I've meant to congratulate you when the time came. I should say it had come now." There was a candour about him that Conquest could scarcely discredit, though he was unwilling to trust it too far. "Thanks, old man. I scarcely expected you to be so well posted. May I ask how—" "Oh, I've known it a long time. Miss Strange told me before I went to South America last spring." This evidence of a confidential relation between the two gave him a second shock, but he postponed its consideration, contenting himself for the moment with making it plain to Ford that hands off must be the first rule of the game. His next move was meant to carry the play into the opponent's quarters. "As a matter of fact, I've never congratulated you," he said with apparent tranquillity. "I've known about you and Evie for some time past, but—" "Oh, that's all off. In the existing circumstances, Evie didn't feel like keeping the thing up." "That's too bad. You've been pretty hard hit, what? When a fellow is as game as you, a girl should stand by him. Come now." "But I know Evie. I've known her from her cradle. She'll back round, you'll see. When we pulled you through, as we're going to, she'll take another view of things. I know for a fact that she's been head over heels in love with you ever since her trip to Buenos Aires." As Ford made no remark, Conquest felt it well to drive the point home. "We can all help in that, old boy, and you can count on us, both on Miss Strange and me. No one has such influence over Evie as Miriam, and I know she's very keen on seeing you and Evie, hit it off. I don't mind telling you that, as a matter of fact, it's been Miriam's anxiety on Evie's account that has mixed me up in your case at all. I don't say that I haven't got interested in you for your own sake, but it was she who stirred me up in the first place. It's going to mean a lot to her to see you get through and marry Evie." Ford smiled, his odd twisted smile. But as he said nothing, Conquest decided to let the subject drop. He had in fact gone as far as his present judgment would carry him, and anything farther might lead to a false step. In a situation alive with claims and counterclaims, with yearnings of the heart and promptings of the higher law, he could preserve his rights only by a walk as wary as the treading of a tightrope. This became clearer to him later in the night, when Ford had gone away, and he was left free to review the circumstances with that clarity of coordination he had so often brought to bear on other men's affairs. Out of the mass of data he selected two conditions as being the only ones of importance. If Miriam Strange was marrying him because she loved him, nothing else needed to be considered. This fact would subordinate everything to itself, and there were many arguments to support the assumption that she was doing so. One by one he marshalled them before him, from the first faint possibility up to the crowning proof that there was no earthly reason for her marrying him at all, unless she wanted to. He pointed that out to her clearly on the day when she came to him to make her terms. He had been guilty on that occasion of a foolish generosity, for that it went with a common-sense honesty to take advantage of another ignorance or impassiveness was part of his business creed. Nevertheless, having shown her this uncalled-for favour, he did not regret it now, since it put the spontaneous, voluntary nature of her act beyond dispute. To a late hour of the night, he wandered about the great silent rooms of the house which he had made the expression of himself. Stored with costly, patiently selected comforts, it lacked only the last requisite, which was to impart the living touch. Having chosen this essential with so much care, and begun to feel for her something far more vital than the pride of possession which had been his governing emotion hitherto, it was an agony with many aspects to think he might have to let her go. That there was this possibility was undeniable. It was the second of the two paramount considerations. Though Ford's enthusiasm tried to make itself enthusiasm and no more, there being little difficulty in seeing what it was. All the same, it would be a passion to pity and ignore if on Miriam's side there was nothing to respond to it. But it was here that, in spite of all his arguments, Conquest's doubts began. With much curious ignorance of women, there was a point of view from which he knew them well. It was out of many a poignant bit of domestic history, of which his profession had made him the confidant, that he distilled the observation made to Ford earlier in the evening. It isn't often that a woman's heroism works in a straight line like a soldier's or a fireman's. Notwithstanding her directness, he could see Miriam Strange as just the type of woman to whom these words might be applicable. If, by marrying a man whom she did not love, she thought she could help another whom she did love, a culpable sacrifice was just the thing of which she would be capable. He called it culpable sacrifice with some emphasis, for in his eyes all sacrifice was culpable. It was more than culpable in that it verged on the absurd. There were few teachings of an illogical religion, few promptings of a misdirected energy, for which he had a greater scorn than the precept that the strong should suffer for the weak, or one man for another. Every man for himself, and the survival of the fittest was the doctrine by which he lived, and his abhorrence of anything else was the more intense for the moment because he found himself in a situation where he might be expected to repudiate his faith. But there it was, that something in public opinion which, in certain circumstances, might challenge him, might ask him for magnanimity, might appeal to him for mercy, might demand that he make two other human beings happy while he denied himself. It was preposterous, it was grotesque, but it was there. He could hear its voice already, explaining that since Miriam Strange had given him her word in an excess of self-devotion, it was his duty to let her off. He could see the line of argument. He could hear the applause following on his noble act. He had heard it before, especially in the theatre, and his soul had shaken with laughter. He had read of it in novels, only to toss such books aside. The beauty of renunciation, he had often said, appeals to the morbid, the sickly, and the sentimental. It has no function among the healthy and the sane. He not only said that, but he had believed it. He believed it still, and lived by it. By doing so he had amassed his modest fortune, and won a respected position in the world. He had not got on into middle life without meeting the occasion more than once when he could have saved others, a brother, or a sister, or a friend, and forborne to save himself. He had felt the temptation and resisted it, with the result that he was up in the world when he might have been down in it, and envied by those who would have despised him without hesitation when they had got out of him all he could give. He could look back now and see the folly it would have been had he yielded to impulses that every sentimentalist would have praised. He was fully conscious that the moment of danger might be on the point of returning again, and that he must be prepared for it. He was able to strengthen himself with the greater conviction because of his belief in the sanctity of rights. The securing of rights, the defining of rights, the protection of rights, had been his trade ever since he was 25. The invasion of rights was among the darkest crimes in his calendar. In the present case, his own rights could not be called into question. They were inviolable. Miriam Strange had come to him deliberately, and for due consideration had signed herself away. He had spared nothing, in time, pains, or money, to fulfil his part of the compact. It would be monstrous, therefore, if he were to be cheated of his reward. That either Ford or Miriam would attempt this he did not believe, even if between them the worst, from his point of view, was at the worst. But that an absurd, elusive principle which called itself chivalry, but really was effeminacy of will, might try to disarm him by an appeal to scruples he contemned, was the possibility he feared. He feared it because he estimated at its worth the force of restraint a sentimental civilization and a naive people can bring to bear in silent pressure upon the individual. While he knew himself to be strong in his power of resistance, he knew too that the mightiest swimmer can go down at last in a smiling, unrippled sea. His exasperation was as much with his doubt about himself as with the impalpable forces threatening him as he strode fiercely from room to room, turning out the flaring lights before going to bed. After all, his final resolutions were pitifully insufficient, in view of the tragic element, for he took it tragically, that had suddenly crept into his life. While his gleam of happiness was in danger of going out, the sole means he could find of keeping it aglow was in deciding on a prudent ignoring of whatever did not meet the eye, on a discreet assumption that what he had been dreaming for the past few months was true. As a matter of fact, there was nothing to show him that it wasn't true, and it was only common sense to let the first move towards clearing his vision come from the other side rather than from his. And yet, it was precisely this passive attitude which he found himself next day least able to maintain. If he needed anything further to teach him that love was love, it was this restless, prying jealousy, making it impossible to let well enough alone. After a trying day at the office, during which he irritated his partners and worried his clerks, he presented himself late in the afternoon at Miriam's apartment at the hour when he generally went to his club, and he knew she would not expect him. Thinking to surprise Ford with her, like the suspicious husband in a French play, he owned to himself grimly, he experienced something akin to disappointment to find her drinking tea with two old ladies, whom he outstayed. During the ceremonies of their leave-taking, he watched Miriam closely, seeking for some impossible proof that she either loved Ford or did not love him, and getting nothing but a renewed and maddening conviction of her grace and quiet charm. What about Evie's happiness? Miriam raised her eyebrows inquiringly at the question before stooping to put out the spirit lamp. Well, what about it? She asked without looking up. Oh, nothing, except that we don't seem to be securing it. She gazed at him now, with an expression frankly puzzled. He had refused tea, but she kept her accustomed place behind the tea-table, while he stretched himself comfortably in the low arm-chair by the hearth, which she often occupied herself. Don't you remember, he went on, Evie's happiness was the motive of our little agreement. He endeavoured to make his tone playful, but there was a something sharp and aggressive in his manner, at which she coloured slightly, no less than at his words. I suppose, she said, as if after meditation, Evie's happiness isn't in our hands. True, but there's a good deal that is in our hands. There's, for example, our own. Up to a point, yes. And up to that point we should take care of it, shouldn't we? I dare say, but I don't know what you mean. He gave the nervous little laugh which helped him over moments of embarrassment. Ford was with me last night. He said it was all off between him and Evie. I thought he might tell you that. So that, he went on, forcing a smile with which his voice and manner were not in accord, our undertaking having failed, the bottom's out of everything. Don't you see? He was so astonished that she walked into his trap just as he expected. I don't see it in the least. I thought our undertaking, as you call it, was going to be particularly successful. Successful? How? He dropped his smile and looked interrogative, his bit of acting still keeping her off her guard. Why, if Amalia Graham's testimony is all you think it's going to be. Oh, I see, that's the way you look at it. Isn't it the way you look at it, too? He smiled again, indulgently, but with significance. No, I confess it isn't. At least it hasn't been. I thought, perhaps I was wrong, that our interest was in getting Ford off so that he could marry Evie. Since he isn't going to marry her, why, naturally we don't care so much whether he gets off or not. Oh, but... She checked herself. She even grew a little pale. She began to see dimly whither he was leading her. Of course, I don't say we should chuck him over, he went on, but it isn't the same thing any longer, is it? I think it only fair to point that out to you, because it gives you reasonable ground for reconsidering your decision.
Oh, but I don't want to. While she had said exactly what he hoped to hear, she had not said it as he hoped to hear it. There were shades of tone even to impetuosity, and this one lacked the note his ear was listening for. Nonetheless, he told himself, a wise man would have stopped right there, and he was conscious of his folly in persisting, while he still persisted. "That's for you to decide, of course. Only if we go on, it must be understood that we've somewhat shifted our ground." "I haven't shifted mine." "Not as you understand it yourself, as possibly you've understood it all along. But you have, as I see things. When you came to my office—" She put up her hand as though she would have screened her face, but controlled herself to listen quietly. "Your object then," Conquest continued, cruelly, "was to get Ford off, so that he might marry Evie. Now I understand it to be simply to get him off." She looked at him with eyes full of distress or protest. It was a minute or two before she spoke. "I don't see the necessity for such close definition." "I do. I want you to know exactly what you're doing. I want you to see that you're paying a higher price than you need pay for the services rendered." He had got her now, just where he had been trying to put her. He had snared her, or given her an opportunity, according as she chose to take it. She could have availed herself of the latter by a look or a simple intonation, for the craving of his heart was such that his perceptions were acute for the slightest hint. Had she known that, it would have been easy for her to respond to him, playing her part with the loyalty with which she had begun it. As it was, his cold manner and his slightly mocking tone betrayed her. Her answer was meant to give him the kind of assurance she thought he was looking for, and she couched it in the language she supposed he would most easily understand. In the things it said and did not say, her very sincerity was what stabbed him. "I hope it won't be necessary to bring this subject up again. I know what I undertook, and I'm anxious to fulfil it. I should be very much hurt if I wasn't allowed to, just because you had scruples about taking me at my word. You've been so splendid in doing your part that I should feel humiliated if I didn't do mine." There was earnestness in her regard, and a suggestion of haughtiness in the tilt of her head. The wise man within him bade him be content, and this time he listened to the voice. He did her the justice to remember, too, that she was offering him all he had ever asked of her, and if he was dissatisfied, it was because he had increased his demands without telling her. It was by a transition of topic that he saw he could nail her to her purpose. "By the way," he said, when they got on neutral ground again and were speaking of Wayne, "I wish you would come and see what I think of doing for him. There are 2 rooms back of my library, too dark for my use, but that wouldn't matter to him, poor fellow." He saw that she was nerving herself not to flinch at this confrontation with the practical. He saw, too, that her courage and her self-command would have deceived anyone but him. The very pluck with which she nodded her comprehension of his idea, and her sympathy with it, enraged him to a point at which, so it seemed to him, he could have struck her. Had she cried off from her bargain, he could have borne it far more easily. That would at least have given him a sense of superiority, and helped him to be magnanimous, while this readiness to pay put him in the wrong, and drove him to exact the uttermost farthing of his rights. On a weak woman he might have taken pity, but this strong creature, who refused to sue to him by so much as the quiver of an eyelid, and rejected his concessions before he had time to put them forth, exasperated every nerve that had been wont to tingle to his sense of power. Since she had asked no quarter, why should he give it? Above all, when to give quarter was against his principles. "And perhaps," he pursued, in an even voice, showing no sign of the tempest within, "that would be as good a time as any for you to look over the entire house, if there are any changes you would like to have made." "I don't think there will be." "All the same, I should like you to see. A man's house, however well arranged, isn't always right for a woman's occupancy, and so—" "Very well, I'll come." "When?" "I'll come tomorrow." "About 4?" "Yes, about 4. That would suit me perfectly." She spoke frankly, and even smiled faintly, with just such a shadow of a blush as the situation called for. The wise man within him begged once more to be content. If, the wise man argued, this well-poised serenity was not love, it was something so like it that the distinction would require a splitting of hairs. Conquest strove to listen and obey, but even as he did so, he was aware again of that rage of impotence which finds its easiest outlet in violence. As he rose to take his leave, with all the outward signs of friendly ceremoniousness, he had time to be appalled at the perception that he, the middle-aged, spick-and-span New Yorker, should so fully understand how it is that a certain type of frenzied brute can kill the woman whom he passionately loves, but who is hopelessly out of reach. End of Part 4, Chapter 23.
Part 4, Chapter 24 of The Wild Olive by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 24. Except when his business instincts were on the alert, Ford's slowness of perception was perhaps most apparent in his judgment of character and his analysis of other people's motives. Taking men and women as he found them, he had little tendency to speculate as to the impulses within their lives, any more than as to the furnishings behind their house fronts. A human being was all exterior to him, something like a street. Even in matters that touched him closely, the act alone was his concern, and he dealt with its consequences without, as a rule, much inquisitive probing of its cause. So when Miriam Strange elected to marry Conquest, he accepted the settled fact, for the time being, in the spirit in which he would have taken some disastrous manifestation of natural phenomena. Investigation of the motive of such a step was as little in his line as it would have been in the case of a destructive storm at sea. To his essentially simple way of viewing life, it was something to be lamented, but to be borne as best one was able, while one said as little as one could about it. And yet, somewhere in the wide, rarely explored regions of his nature, there were wonderings, questionings, yearnings, protests, cries, that forced themselves to the surface now and then, as the boiling waters within the earth gush out in geyser springs. It required urgent pressure to impel them forth, but when they came, it was with violence. Such an occasion had been his night on Lake Champlain. Such another was the evening when he announced to Miriam his intention of becoming Norrie Ford again. When these moments came, they took him by surprise, even though afterward he was able to recognize the fact that they had been long preparing. It was in this way, without warning, that his heart had sprung on him the question, why should she marry him? At the minute when Conquest was leaving Miriam, he, Ford, was tramping the streets of New York, watching them grow alive with light in glaring, imaginative ugliness, ugliness so dazzling in its audacity and so fanciful in its crude commercialism that it had the power to thrill. It was perhaps the electric stimulus of sheer light that quickened the pace of his slow mentality from the march of acceptance to the rush of protest, at an instant when he thought he had resigned himself to the facts. Why should she marry Conquest? He was shouldering his way through the crowds when the question made itself heard, with a curious illuminating force that suggested its own answer. He was walking, partly to work off the tension of the strain under which these few days were passing, and partly because he had got the idea that he was being shadowed. He had no profound objection to that, though he would have preferred to give himself up of his own free will rather than to be arrested. Perhaps, after all, it was only an accident that had caused him to catch sight of the same two men at different moments through the day, and just now it amused him to put them to the test by leading them a dance. He had come to the conclusion that he had been mistaken, or that he had outwitted them, when this odd question, irrelevant to anything he had directly in his thoughts, presented itself as though it had been asked by some voice outside him. Why should she marry him? Up to the present, his unanalytical mind would have replied, as it would have replied to the same query concerning anyone else, that she was marrying him because she wanted to. That would have seemed to him to cover the whole ground of anyone's affairs. But all at once it had become insufficient. It was as if the street had suddenly become insufficient as a highway, breaking into a chasm. He stopped abruptly, confronting, as it were, that bewildering void which a psychological situation invariably seemed to him. To get into a place where his few straightforward formulae did not apply gave him that sense of distress which every creature feels out of its native element. It was a proof of the dependence with which, in matters requiring mental or emotional experience, he had come to lean on Miriam Strange, as well as of the directness with which he appealed to her for help, that he should face about on the instant and turn his steps toward her. Only a few minutes earlier she had seen Conquest go, and in the interval since his departure she had had time to detect the windings of his strategy, and to be content with the skill with which she had met them. She understood him thoroughly, both in his fear of letting her go and his shame at holding her. Standing in her wide bay window, her slight figure erect, her hands behind her back, she looked down, without seeing it, on the spangled city, as angels intent on their own high thoughts might pass over the Milky Way. She smiled faintly to herself, thinking how she should lead this kindly man, who for her sake had done so much for Norrie Ford, back to a sense of security and self-respect. When Norrie Ford went free, she meant to live for nothing else but the happiness of the man who had cleared his name and given him back to the world. It would be a kind of consecration to her, like that of the nun who forsakes the dearest ties for a life of good works and a prayer. Conquest had told her that she was paying a bigger price than she needed to pay for the services rendered, but that depended somewhat on the value one set on the services. In this case she would not have been content in paying less. To do so would seem to indicate that she was not grateful. Since perceiving his compunction as to claiming his reward, she was aware of an elation, an exultation, in forcing it upon him. She was in the glow of this sentiment when Ford was ushered in. He was so vitally in her thoughts that, though she did not expect him, his presence gave her no surprise. It helped her, in fact, to sustain the romantic quality in her mood, to treat his coming as a matter of course, and make it a natural incident to the moment. "Come and look down on the stars," she said, in the tone she might have used to another member of her household who had appeared accidentally. "The view here in the evening makes one feel as if one had been wafted above the sky." She half turned toward him, but did not offer her hand as he took his place by her side. For a few seconds he said nothing, and when he spoke she accepted his words in the manner in which she had taken his coming. "So you're going to marry Conquest?" It was to show that the abrupt remark had not perturbed her that she nodded her head assentingly, still with the smile that had greeted his arrival. "Why?" In spite of her efforts she manifested some surprise. "What makes you ask that question now?" "Because it never occurred to me before that there might be a special reason." "Well, there is one." "Has it anything to do with me?" She backed away from him slightly, to the side curve of the window where it joined to the straight line of the wall. In this position she had him more directly in view. "I said there was a reason," she answered, after some hesitation. "I didn't say I would tell you what it was." "No, but you will, won't you?" "I don't see why you should want to know." "Is that quite true?" he queried, with a somewhat startling fixing of his eyes upon her. "Don't you see? Can't you imagine?" "I don't see why, in such circumstances as these, any man would want to know what a woman doesn't tell him." "Then I'll explain to you. I want to know because I think you're marrying Conquest when you don't love him." "He never asked me to love him. He said he could do without that." "While you do love someone else?" He reflected before speaking. Under his piercing look she took on once more the appealing expression of forest creatures at bay. "Even if that were true," she said at last, "there would be no harm in it, as long as there was what you asked me for at first, a special reason." "Is there ever a reason for a step like that? I don't believe it." "But I do believe it, you see. That makes a difference." It would make a still greater difference if I begged you not to do it, wouldn't it? She shook her head. It wouldn't, now. I let you see yesterday that I loved you. Since you forced me to acknowledge it, yes. And you've shown me, he ventured, within the last minute, that you love me. Her figure grew more erect against the background of exterior darkness. Even the hand that rested on the woodwork of the window became tense. Lambent fire in her eyes, the light that he used to call non-Aryan, took the place of the fugitive glance of the woodland animal. But she kept her composure. Well, what then? Then you'd be committing a sacrilege against yourself if you married anyone else but me. If her heart bounded at the words, she did nothing to betray it. You say that because it seems so to you. I take another view of it. Love to me does not necessarily mean marriage, any more than marriage necessarily implies love. There have been happy marriages without love, and there can be honourable love that doesn't ask marriage as its object. If I married you now, I should seem to myself to be deserting a high impulse for a lower one. There's only one sort of impulse to love. Not to my love. I know what you mean, but my love has more than one prompting, and the highest is, or I hope it is, to try to do what's right. But this would not be right. I'm the only judge of that. Not if we love each other. In that case I become a judge of it too. Once more she reflected. In speaking she lifted her head and looked at him frankly. Very well, I'll admit it. Perhaps it's true. In any case, I'd rather things were clear to you. It will help us both. I'll tell you what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. It was one of those occasions when a woman's emotion is so great that she seems to have none at all. As iron is said to come to a degree of heat so intense that it does not burn, so Miriam Strange seemed to herself to have reached a stage where the sheer truth, simple and without reserve, could bring no shame to her womanhood. Words that could not have passed her lips either before that evening or after it escaped her in the subsequent minutes as a matter of course. I entered into your life twice, and each time I did you harm. On the first occasion I turned you into Herbert Strange and sent you out on a career of deception. On the second, I came between you and Evie and brought you to the present pass, where you're facing death again, as you were 8 or 9 years ago. It's no use to tell you that I wanted to do my best, because good intentions are not much excuse for the trouble they often cause. But I'm ready to say this, that whenever you've suffered, I've suffered more. That's especially true of what's happened in the last 6 months. When I saw how much I had put wrong, it was a comfort to think that there was something at least that I could put right again. But you've put nothing wrong. That's what I should like to convince you of. I've put you in a position of danger. When I see that, I see enough to act upon. It is a very slight danger. It is now because I've made it slight. It wasn't before I went to Mr. Conquest. You went to him? What for? He wanted me to marry him. He wanted it for a long time. I told him I would do so, on condition that he found the evidence that would prove you innocent. Ford laughed harshly and rather loudly, stopping suddenly as though he had ceased to see the joke. So that's it. That's why Conquest has been so devilishly kind. I wondered at his interest, or at least I should have wondered if I'd had the time. As a matter of fact, I took it for granted that he should help me, as a drowning man takes it for granted that the chance passer-by should pull him out. It wasn't till this evening, about half an hour ago. By Jove, I ran right up against it. You ran right up against what? Against the truth. It came in a flash, just like that. He snapped his fingers. You're selling yourself to get me off. She seemed to grow straighter, taller. For the minute he saw nothing but the blaze of her eyes. Well, why shouldn't I? My mother sold herself to get a man off. He was my father. I'm proud of her. She did the best she could with her life. I'm doing the best I can with mine." "But I shouldn't be doing the best I can with mine if I let you continue." "Isn't it too late for you to stop me? If I've sold myself, as you put it, the price has been paid in. Mr. Conquest has secured the evidence that will acquit you. It will be used. That's all I care about, much." She saw the hot colour surge into his cheeks and brows. It seemed to her that his eyes grew red as the blood left his lips. She had never before been called on to confront a man angry with a passion beyond his control, but instinct told her what the signs were. Instinct told her, too, that, however confused his own sensations might be, his anger was not so much resentment against anything she might have done, as it was despair at having lost her. She had guessed already that he would be seized with a blind impulse to strike, as soon as he came to a realizing sense of her action, though she had not expected the moment of his fury till after he went free. Till then she had thought he would be partially unconscious of his pain, just as a soldier fighting will run along for a while without feeling a bullet in his flesh. The anticipation of an awakening on his part, sometime, enabled her to see beyond the madness of this instinct, even though the words he threw at her struck like stones. The very fact that she could see how he laboured with himself to keep them back gave her strength to take them without flinching. "You dared, without my permission?" "I'd done so many things without your permission that it seemed I could venture that far." "You were wrong. It was too far." "It wasn't too far when I loved you." She uttered the words in a matter-of-fact voice, without a tremor. She foresaw their effect in bringing him to himself. In his next words his tone had already softened slightly to one of protest. "But I could have done it so much better, so much more easily, without—" "I could have done that too. Mr. Conquest pointed it out to me. He took no advantage of my ignorance. As a matter of fact, I wasn't ignorant at all. I was extremely clear-sighted and wise. My love for you made me so. I knew, I felt it, that money might fail to do what I wanted. But I knew too that there was one thing that wouldn't fail. If you were innocent, and I wasn't wholly sure that you were, I knew there was one energy that could surely prove you so, and that was Charles Conquest's desire to have me as his wife. I took the course in which there was least risk of failure, and you see—" A little gesture, triumphant in its suggestion, finished her sentence. "What I see is this," Ford answered thickly, "that I am to hold my life at the cost of your degradation." "Degradation? That's a hard word. But as applied to me, I don't know what it means." "Isn't it degradation to enter into a marriage in which you put no love?" There was a kind of superb indifference in her answer. "I am to hold my life at the cost of your degradation?" "You may call it degradation if you choose. I shouldn't. As long as you go free, you can call my action anything you like." "I dare say," she admitted, "you're quite right from the highest moral and modern point of view, but that doesn't appeal to me. You see, you've got to make allowances for it. I'm not a child of your civilization. I'm not a child of any civilization at all. At best, I'm like the wild creature that submits to being tamed because it doesn't know what else to do, but remains wild at heart. I used to think I could come into your system of law and order if anyone would take me, but now I know I shall always be outside it. The very word you've just used of me shows me that. You say I'm to be degraded. It's your civilized point of view. I have no comprehension of that whatever. Because I love you, I want to save you. I don't care anything about the means so long as I reach the end. To undo the harm I've done to you, I'd freely give my body to be burned. So why shouldn't I?" "No, no," she cried, as he made as though he would approach her. "Keep away. Don't come near me. I can only talk to you like this, at a distance. I shall never say these things again. But I want to tell you, to explain to you. I should like you to understand." She repeated herself haltingly, because, as Ford held back from approaching her, a sudden spasm passed over his face while he hung his head and compressed his lips in a way that made him seem surprisingly boyish all at once, and touched that maternal tenderness in her that had always formed such a large part of her yearning over him. It was the kind of tenderness that steadied her own nerve and kept her dry-eyed and strong, as she saw him reel to a chair, and, flinging his arms on the table beside it, bow himself down on them, while his form shook convulsively. She had no shame for him, understood perfectly that the pressure of years had been brought to bear on the complex emotions of the moment, to which reaction from his brief anger and his bitter words added an element of remorse, to cause this honest, manly nature, that had never made any pretence of being stronger than it was, to give way to the instant's weakness. She was sure he would never have done it in the presence of anyone but her, and she was thrilled with a curious joy at this proof of their spiritual intimacy. What was difficult was not the keeping of her own self-control, but the holding herself back from crossing the room and laying a hand on his shoulder in token of their oneness at heart. But there, she felt, the forbidden line would be passed. She could only wait, it was not long, till he was calm again. Then he pulled himself together, got up heavily, and obviously refrained from looking her in the face. In the act and the attitude there was something so boylike, so natural, so entirely lacking in the dignity of grief, that if she had any impulse to let her own tears flow, it was then. But she knew it to be one of those minutes when a woman has to be strong for herself and for the man too, even though she break down afterward. The necessity of coming to an understanding with him, once for all, impelled her to the economy of her forces, while the nervous snapping of his fortitude had given her an opportunity she could not afford to lose. "So I want you to see," she went on quietly, as though no interruption had occurred, "that having gained my point in helping to get you off, it's to some extent a matter of indifference what you think of me, what anyone thinks of me, just as it was when I hid you in my studio nearly 9 years ago. You must put it down to my being of wild origin and not wholly amenable to civilized dictates. I can only do what the inward urging drives me on to do, just as my mother did, and my father. If it's degrading—" Raising his head at last, he strode towards her. He put his hands rigidly behind his back, as if to show her that he pinioned them there in token that she had nothing to fear from him. His eyes were red, and there was still a painful tightening about his lips. "You'll have to let me take that back," he muttered unsteadily. "I didn't know what I was saying. It's come on me so suddenly that it's broken me all up. I hadn't realized till this evening what everything meant. It seemed to me then that I couldn't stand it." "But you can." "Yes, I can," he replied doggedly. "One can stand anything. If I reached my limit for a minute, it was in seeing that you have to suffer for my sake." "Wouldn't you suffer for mine?" "I couldn't. Suffering for your sake would become such a joy." "That it wouldn't be suffering. That's just it. That's what I feel exactly. It isn't hard for me to do what I'm doing, because I know I'm helping to save your honour, if not your life. I don't believe money would have done it. Mr. Conquest reminded me that the best legal services can be bought. But I never thought for an instant that you could secure zeal such as his for anything less than I offered him. And he's been so superb. He's given himself up to the thing, absolutely. He's followed every trail with a scent, with a certainty. Your other men, your Kilcup and Warren, would never have been capable of. I've seen that, I'm sure of it. He has a wonderful mind, and in his way he has the kindest heart in the world. I'm very, very fond of him, and I'm deeply grateful. Next to seeing you free, I don't think I have any desire in life so strong as to make him happy. I dare say that isn't civilized either, but it's what I feel. And so we must think of this," she continued, eagerly explanative. "We must be loyal to him, you and I, as the first of all our duties. Don't you think so?" He withdrew his eyes from hers before answering. His power of resistance was broken. The signs of struggle were visible, and yet the quixotic element in his own nature helped him to respond to that in hers. "I'll try," he muttered, looking on the ground. "You'll do more than try. You'll succeed. Only very small souls could grudge him what he's earned, when he's worked so hard and given himself so unstintingly. The very fact that you and I know that we love each other will make it easier to be true to him. Conquest must know that we love each other too," he declared with some bitterness. "Perhaps he does. But you see, everyone has a different way of looking at life, and I don't think that with him it's a thing that counts greatly. I'm not sure that I understand him in that respect. I only know that you and I, who owe him so much, can repay him by giving him what he asked for. Will you promise me to do it?" He continued to look downward, as though finding it hard to give his word. But when he raised his eyes again, he flung back his head with his old air of resolution. "I'll promise to do anything you ask me throughout our lives. I don't admit that Conquest should demand this thing, or that he had any right to let you offer it. But since you want to give it, and I can show you no other token of my love, and shall never again be able to tell you that I adore you, I promise to obey." End of Part 4, Chapter 24. Part 4, Chapter 25 of The Wild Olive by Basil King. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Part 4, Chapter 25. The inspection of the house was over, and they had come back to the drawing-room for tea. Conquest had lavished pains on the occasion, putting flowers in the rooms and strewing handsome objects carelessly about, so as to impart to the great shell as much as possible the air of being lived in. To the tea-table he had given particular attention, ordering out the most ornamental silver and the costliest porcelain, and placing the table itself just where she would probably have it in days to come, so as to get the effect she produced in sitting there, as he liked to do with a new picture or piece of furniture. On her part, Miriam had made the rounds of the rooms with conscientious care, observing, admiring, suggesting, with just that mingling of shyness and interest with which a woman in her situation would view her future home. Having got, by intuition, the idea that he was watching for some flaw in her manner, she was determined that he should find none. It was the beginning of that lifelong schooling to his service to which she had vowed herself, though the effort would have been easier had he not rendered her self-conscious by scanning her so keenly out of his little grey-green eyes. Nevertheless, she was pleased with the manner in which she was acquitting herself, giving him his tea and taking her own with no sign of embarrassment. As on the preceding day, it was this perfection of acting, as he chose to call it, that exasperated his restless suspicion more than any display of weakness. The thought that she was keeping her true self locked against him had, during the last 24 hours, become an obsession, making it impossible for him to eat or to sleep. In her serene, impeccable bearing, he saw nothing but the bars up and the blinds drawn down. An instant of faltering or self-betrayal would have admitted him to at least a glimpse of what was passing within. But through this well-balanced graciousness, it was as difficult to get at her soul as to read the mind of the Venus of Milo in the marble nobility of her face. He had led her from room to room, describing one, explaining another, and apologizing for a third, but all the while trying to break down her guard, only to find, as they returned to the point at which they started, that he had failed. It was with nerves all unstrung, and with a lack of self-command he would have been, in his saner senses, the first to condemn, that he strode up at last and rapped sharply at the door of her barricaded citadel. "Why did you never tell me that you knew Norrie Ford, years ago?" He was putting his empty cup on the table as he spoke, so that he could avoid looking at her. She was glad of this respite from his gaze, for she found the question startling. Before the scrutiny of his eyes was turned on her again, she had herself in hand. "I should probably have told you sometime." "Very likely. The odd thing is that you didn't tell me at once." "It wasn't so odd, given all the circumstances." It wasn't so odd, given some of the circumstances, but given them all, I should say I ought to have known." She allowed a few seconds to pass. "I suppose," she said slowly, then, "that may fairly be considered a matter of opinion. I don't see, however, that it makes much difference, since you know now." "My knowing or not knowing now isn't quite the point. The fact of importance is that you never told me." "I'm sorry you should take it in that way. But since I didn't, and the matter is beyond remedy, I suppose we shouldn't gain anything by discussing it." "I don't know about that. It seems to me a subject that ought to be aired." He tried to smile down his aggressiveness, succeeding partially, in that he subdued the quarrelsomeness of his voice and manner to that affectation of banter behind which he concealed habitually his real self, and by which he most easily deceived her. "Very well," she laughed. "I'm quite ready to air it, only I don't know just how it's to be done." "Suppose you were to tell me what happened in your own language." "If Mr. Ford has told you already, as I imagine he has, I don't see that my language can be very different from his. All the same, I'll try, since you want me to." "Just so." During the few minutes she took to collect her thoughts, he could see sweep over her features one of those swift, light changes, as delicate as the ripple of summer wind on water, which transformed her in an instant from the woman of the world to the forest maid, the spirit of the indigenous. The mystery of the nomadic ages was in her eyes again as she began her narrative, wistfully and reminiscently. "You see, I'd been thinking a good deal of my father and mother. I hadn't known about them very long, and I lived with their memory. The Mother Superior told me a few things, all she knew, I suppose, before I left the convent at Quebec, and Mr. and Mrs. Wayne, especially Mrs. Wayne, had added the rest. That was the chief reason why I wanted the studio, so that I could get away from the house, which was so oppressive to me, and, so it seemed to me, live with them with nothing but the woods and the hills and the sky about me. I could be very happy then, painting things I fancied they might have done, and pinning them up on the wall. I dare say it was foolish, but it was very natural. Go on." "And then came up all this excitement about Norrie Ford. For months the whole region talked of nothing else. Nearly everyone believed he had shot his uncle, but, except in the villages, the sympathy with him was tremendous. Some people, especially the hotel keepers and those who depended on the tourist travel, were for law and order, but others said that old Chris Ford had got no more than he deserved. That was the way they used to talk. Mr. Wayne was on the side of law and order, too, naturally, till the trial came on, and then he began. I know all about that. Go on." "My own sympathy was with the man in prison. I used to dream about him. I remembered what Mrs. Wayne had told me my mother had done for my father. I was proud of that. Though I knew only vaguely what it was, I was sure it was what I should have done too. So when there was talk of breaking into the jail and helping Norrie to escape, I used to think how easily I could keep anyone hidden in my studio. I don't mean I thought of it as a practical thing. It was just a dream." "But a dream that came true." "Yes, it came true. It was wonderful. It was the day Mr. Wayne sentenced him. I knew what he was suffering. Mr. Wayne, I mean. We were all suffering, even Mrs. Wayne, who in her gentle way was generally so hard. Some people thought Mr. Wayne needn't have done it, and I suppose it was just his conscientiousness, because he had such a horror of the thing, that drove him on to it. He thought he mustn't shirk his duty. But that night at the house was awful. We dressed for dinner and tried to act as if nothing frightful had happened, but it was as if the hangman was sitting with us at the table. At last I couldn't endure it. I went out into the garden. You remember, it was one of those gardens with clipped yews. Out there in the air I stopped thinking of Mr. Wayne and his distress to think of Norrie Ford. It seemed to me as if in some strange way he belonged to me, that I ought to do something, as my mother had done for my father. And then all of a sudden I saw him creep in." "How did you know it was he?" "I thought it must be. though I was only sure of it when I was on the terrace and saw his face. He crept along and crept along. Oh, such a forlorn, hopeless, outcast figure! My heart ached at the sight of him. I didn't know what he meant to do, and at first I had no intention of attempting anything. It was by degrees that my own thought about the studio came back to me. By that time he was on the veranda of the house, and I was afraid he meant to kill Mr. Wayne. I went after him. I thought I would entice him away and hide him. But the minute he heard my footstep, he leaped into the house. The next I saw, he was talking to Mr. and Mrs. Wayne, and something told me he wouldn't hurt them. After that, I watched my chance till he looked outward, and then I beckoned to him. That's how it happened.
And then?
After that, everything was easy. He must have told you. I kept him in the studio for 3 weeks, and brought him food, and clothing of my father's. It seemed to me that my father was doing everything, not I. That's what made it so simple. I know my father would have wanted me to do it. I was only the agent in carrying out his will.
That's one way of looking at it, Conquest said grimly.
It's the only way I've ever looked at it. The only way I ever shall.
It was a romantic situation, he observed, when she had given him the outlines of the rest of the story. I wonder you didn't fall in love with him. He smoothed the colourless line of his moustache, as though concealing a smile. He had recaptured the teasing tone he liked to employ towards her, though its nervous sharpness would have betrayed him had she suspected his real thoughts. While she said nothing in response, the tilt of her head was that which he associated with her moods of indignation or pride. Perhaps you did, he persisted. Then, as she remained silent, did you? He resolved on a bold step, the audacity of that perfect candour she had always taken as a guide. I don't know that one could call it that, she said quietly. He drew a quick inward breath, clenching his teeth, but keeping his fixed smile. But you don't know that one couldn't. I can't define what I felt at all. It was just enough, he pursued in his bantering tone, to keep you looking for him back, as you told me that day. She lifted her eyes in a swift glance of reproach. It was that, then. But it's more now, isn't it? She met him squarely. I don't think you've any right to ask. He laughed aloud, somewhat shrilly. That's good, considering we're to be man and wife. We're to be man and wife on a very distinct understanding to which I'm perfectly loyal. I mean to be loyal to it always, and to you. I shall give you everything you ever asked for. If there are some things, one thing in particular, out of my power to give you, I've said so from the first, and you've told me you could do without them. If what I can't give you I've given to someone else because I couldn't help it, that's my secret, and I claim the right to guard it. They faced one another across the table piled with ornate silver. He had not lost his smile. "You've the merit of being clear," was his only comment. "You force me to be clear," she declared with heightened colour, "and a little angry. When you asked me to be your wife, long ago, I told you there were certain conditions I could never fulfil, and you waived them. On that ground I'm ready to meet all your wishes and make you a good wife to the utmost of my power. I'm eager to do it because I honour and respect you, as women don't always honour and respect the very men they love. I've told Norrie Ford, and I repeat it to you, that after seeing him go free and restored to his place among men, the most ardent desire of my life is to make you happy. I'm perfectly true. I'm perfectly sincere. What more can you ask of me?" He looked at her searchingly, while he thought hard and rapidly. He could not complain that the bars were up and the blinds drawn any longer. On the contrary, she had let him see into the recesses of her life with a clarity that startled him, as pure truth startles often. As he sat musing, his pretence at cynicism fell from him, together with something of his furbished air of youth.
She saw him grow graver, greyer, older, under her very eyes, and was moved with compunction, with compassion. Her face still aglow and her hands clasped in her lap, she leaned to him across the table, speaking in the rich, low voice that always thrilled him. "What I feel for you is something so much like love that you would never have known the difference if you hadn't wrung it from me." Though he toyed aimlessly with some small silver object on the table and did not look up, her words sent a tremor through his frame. The wise man within him was very eloquent, repeating again and again the sentence she herself had used a minute or two ago. What more could he ask of her? What more could he ask of her, indeed, after this assurance, right out of the earnestness and honesty of her pure heart? It was enough to satisfy men with far greater claims than he had ever put forth, and far more pretension than he had ever dreamed of cherishing. The wise man supplied him with 2 or 3 phrases of reply, neat little phrases that would have bound her forever, and yet saved his self-esteem. He turned them over in his mind and on his tongue, trying to add a touch of glamour while he kept them terse. He could feel the wise man fidgeting impatiently, just as he could feel her flaming, expectant eyes upon him. And still he toyed with the small silver object aimlessly, conscious of a certain bitter joy in his soul's suspense. He had not yet looked up, nor polished the wise man's phrases to his taste, when a footman threw the door open, and Norrie Ford himself walked in. The meeting was saved from awkwardness chiefly by Ford's own lack of embarrassment. As he crossed the room and shook hands, first with Miriam, then with Conquest, there was a subdued elation in his manner and glance that reduced small considerations to nothing. "No, I won't sit down," he exclaimed hurriedly, and not without excitement, "because I only looked in for a minute. I've got a cab waiting for me outside. The fact is, I ran in to say good-bye." "Good-bye?" Miriam questioned. "Not for long, I hope. I'm off to give myself up." "Why tonight?" Conquest asked. "What's the rush?" "Only that I wanted to get my word in first. They've got their eye on me. I thought it yesterday, and I know it's today. I wanted to see that I'm not afraid of them, and so I'm asking their hospitality for tonight. I've got my bag in the cab and everything shipshape. I couldn't do it without coming round for a last word with you, old man, and I was going to see you afterward, Miss Strange. But since I found you here—" "You won't have to," she finished brightly. "I'm glad to be able to save your time. I'm confident we're not losing you for long, and as I know you're eager, I can only wish you Godspeed and be glad to see you go." She held out her hand, frankly, strongly, as one who has no fear. "Now," she said, turning to Conquest, "I'll ask you to see me to my motor. I shall leave you and Mr. Ford together, as I know you must have some last detail to arrange." Ford protested, but she gathered up her gloves and furs, and both men accompanied her to the street. It was an autumn evening, drizzling and dark. Up and down Fifth Avenue the wet pavements reflected the electric lamps like blurred mirrors. There were few passengers on foot, but an occasional motor whizzed weirdly out of the dark and into it. It was because there were no other people to be seen that 2 men standing in the rain attracted the attention of the 3 who descended Conquest's steps together. "There they are," Ford said jerkily. "By George, they've got ahead of me." Instinctively Miriam clutched his arm, while one of the 2 strangers came forward apologetically. "You're Mr. John Norrie Ford, ain't you?" "I am." "I'm very sorry, sir, but I've got a warrant for your arrest." "That's all right," Ford said cheerily. "I was on my way to you anyhow. You'll find my bag in the cab and everything ready. We'll drive if it's all the same to you." "Yes, sir. Sure thing, sir." The man dropped back a few paces courteously, while Ford turned to his friends. His air was buoyant. Miriam, too, reflected the radiance of her vision of his triumph. Conquest alone, looking small and white and shriveled in the rain, showed care and fear. "I don't think there's anything special to say," Ford remarked, with the awkwardness of a simple nature at an emotional crisis. "I'm not very good at thanks. Miss Strange knows that already. But it's all in here." He tapped his breast with a characteristic gesture. "Very sacred, very strong." "We know that," Conquest said unsteadily, with an embarrassment like Ford's own. "Well then, good-bye." "Good-bye." With a long pressure of the hand to each, he turned towards his cab. Of the two strangers, one took his place beside the driver on the box, while the other held the door open for Ford to enter. His foot was already on the step, when Miriam cried, "Wait!" He turned toward her as she glided across the wet pavement. "Good-bye, good-bye," she whispered again, and, drawing down his face to hers, she kissed him, as she had kissed him once before, beside the waters of Champlain. As she drew back from him, Ford's countenance wore the uplifted look of a knight who has received the consecration to his quest. Even the two strangers bowed their heads, as though they had witnessed the bestowal of a sacrament. To Miriam, herself, it was the seal set on a past that could never be reopened. She felt the definiteness with which it was ended, as she heard, on the way back to Conquest's side, the door slammed, while the cab lumbered away. It seemed to her that Conquest shrank from her as she approached him. "You'll come tomorrow? I shall be home about 5. Conquest had put her into her motor, drawn the rugs about her, and closed the door. As he did so, she noticed something slow and broken in his movements. Leaning from the open window, she held out her hand, but he barely touched it. "No," he said hoarsely, "I shall not come tomorrow." "Then the next day?" "No, nor the next day." "Well, when you can. If you let me know, I shall stay in whenever it may be." "You needn't stay in. I'm not coming any more." "Oh, don't say that. Don't say that," she pleaded. "You hurt me." "I can't come, Miriam. Don't you see? Isn't it plain enough? I can't come. I thought I could. I tried to think I could hold you, in spite of everything. But I can't. I can't." "You can hold me, if I stay. I want to stay. You mustn't let me go. I want you to be happy. You deserve it. You've done so much for me. And him." As the stress she laid on the last word, a suggestion of something triumphant and enraptured beyond restraint, that made him bound back to the centre of the pavement. "Go on, Laporte," he said to the chauffeur in a sharp voice. "Miss Strange is ready." "No, no!" Miriam cried, stretching both hands towards him. "I'm not ready. Keep me. I want to stay." "Go on," he cried sternly, as the chauffeur hesitated. "Miss Strange is quite ready. She must go." Standing by the curb, he watched the motor glide off into the misty, lamplit darkness. He was watching it still, as it overtook the carriage in which Norrie Ford had just driven away. As the two vehicles passed abreast out of his range of vision, he knew they were bearing Ford and Miriam side by side into life. End of Part 4, Chapter 25. End of The Wild Olive by Basil King.